And we're back. In this next segment, we're going to talk a little bit more about documenting our database. And we've kind of done this already before. We've looked at writing out our database in shorthand notation. And we're still going to kind of use that. We're just going to expand upon that a little more. And so this is going to be what we refer to as database design language, or DBDL for short. And so when we document our database in this fashion, we're kind of identifying a few main key components. The first one being the attributes, the columns that are associated with each entity or table. And then we're going to identify any keys that are in the table. We're going to identify primary keys, and then we're also going to identify other types of keys like alternate keys or secondary keys, and things like that. And then we'll also kind of identify any indexes if we have those set up, and then of course the relationship between our tables, our entities. So let's kind of talk about that a little bit more. So to kind of describe this documentation, it's going to look very similar to, again, that shorthand notation that we've used before, where we're going to have our table or entity name, and then in parentheses we're going to have the attributes for that table, the columns that are part of that table. And so we're going to have the first attribute, the first column, identified as the primary key. This is going to be the first one listed in parentheses, and it's also going to be underlined to identify it as the primary key. And then we're also going to kind of have underneath the table line, we're going to have underneath that any alternate keys that we may have identified within our table, within our relation. And so we're going to document that by having the letters AK, an abbreviation for alternate keys, followed by the column that makes up that alternate key. And so an alternate key, essentially all an alternate key is what we've talked about before as a candidate key, meaning that it could potentially be the primary key, but we're just using something else as the primary key instead. So for whatever the reason may be, we're not using this alternate key as the primary key, but we're still going to identify it as an alternate key with the abbreviation AK 47. And then we're going to have our secondary keys, which we're going to have identified with the abbreviation SK for secondary keys, followed by, of course, the attribute, the column name. So what we mean by a secondary key is essentially a field or combination of fields or attributes that may not necessarily be unique, but which are commonly used for retrieval, and so they should be indexed. And again, creating an index is just a way to more quickly and efficiently retrieve our information from our attributes. So that is secondary key that will be identified as SK, followed by the attribute name. And then finally the foreign key, which will be identified as FK for foreign key. And so again, foreign key is just essentially a primary key in a different table. All right, so let's take a look at what this all looks like instead of just talking about it, right? So here's an example. Again, we can see our shorthand notation as the first line. That should be familiar. We have the table name, then we have each column, each attribute, and then the first column is the primary key, and we know that because it's underlined. That identifies it as a primary key. If you remember back to when we were doing shorthand notation, we would also identify our foreign keys by having them in italics within that shorthand notation. In this expanded view, in this DBDL, database design language, we're actually going to write out the foreign key, and we're going to identify it with FK, meaning that it's the foreign key, right? Same with SK, our secondary key. We can see that in the second line there, right here, student last, student first. So again, this is not necessarily a unique field, but it is a single field or multiple fields that can be commonly used for retrieval, so it's a good idea to index them. And so that's kind of why we do this documentation, because essentially all of our keys should be indexed for quicker retrieval. So SK for secondary key, and then here under professors, we see FK department, so that indicates it is a foreign key, and then we have this arrow character pointing to the primary key, the attribute that it kind of relates to. Sorry, the table, the entity that it resides in, essentially, as the primary key. So you can remember all that foreign key is just a primary key from a different table. So we identify the foreign key attribute, and then we just point to the table that it is the primary key of. So pretty straightforward there. So we list out all of our keys: secondary, foreign key, primary key, right? So again, this isn't too different than the shorthand notation that we're used to. With the shorthand notation, we would just essentially use just one line for each table. Now we're expanding that a little bit more. And this is all we're talking about when we refer to our database design language, DBDL. So you can see it all written out here. Just kind of a way to efficiently document your database, so you can just kind of look at this and get a better understanding and a better picture of the database itself. All right, so I hope that was helpful for you guys. We'll see you in the next segment.